if you look at all of the global problems, whether it's wealth inequality, tax havens, financial markets, nuclear weapons, all of these things suffer from the same destructive global competition dynamic. The fear that each nation has that doing the right thing will harm its economy. And of course, the losers are the environment, ordinary people, the poor, and so on. So what I'm trying to point out really is that it's not that governments don't want to solve these problems, it's that they can't.
Welcome to Facing Future. Today's guest
Thank you.
is John Bunzl, founder of the Simultaneous Policy Campaign, SIMPOL for short. John has worked for over 2 decades on SIMPOL, a framework for international cooperation that allows citizens to drive their governments towards global agreements, enabling them to solve climate and other global problems. A world-centric paradigm based on cooperation, it's driven by citizens and supported by a growing number of politicians around the world. Together with NIck Duffell, he co-authored the SIMPOL Solution, which explores the psychological barriers that prevent people from seeing how destructive global competition is preventing effective action, and instead offers a new, more empowered worldview. Welcome, John. What can you tell us about SIMPOL?
Well, before I tell you about SIMPOL, let me tell you my view or the view of the world and the problems of the world that SIMPOL's based on. So most of us think that that the problem is capitalism, or it's negligent corrupt politicians, or it's rapacious corporations, and I completely understand why people think that. But actually, the problem really today is that there's a mismatch between the globalized economy that we have and only national governance. Okay, so anything that can move globally across national borders, like multinational corporations, like climate, like carbon emissions, like international crime syndicates, anything that can move freely across national borders is going to play one government off against another for advantages. So anything that's globally mobile has an advantage. Anything that's nationally rooted, like governments, ordinary citizens, and the environment, is at a disadvantage. And the way that works is that if we all want climate change solved, of course we do, but any government that acts in advance of any other government to increase taxes on emissions or regulations, that it's only going to make its own businesses uncompetitive with businesses elsewhere. So so no government does it. Well, so that's why climate change is sort of racing ahead like this, but government action is sort of crawling along at a snail's pace.
Or going backwards.
Yeah.
In many cases, we're still subsidizing fossil fuels. We're still putting more projects going. The United States has more projects coming up than any other nation.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. And this is because when capital, every nation needs capital investment for its economy to thrive. And so to do that, it has to make its national economy internationally competitive. So when you're always hearing politicians say, well, we've got to keep the US internationally competitive, we've got to keep Britain internationally competitive. And this means they've got to basically keep taxes on corporations and the rich very, very low, keep regulations low to keep the investment and capital coming in. And of course, the losers are the environment, ordinary people, the poor, and so on. So what I'm trying to point out really is that it's not that governments don't want to solve these problems, it's that they can't. It's a systemic issue. All the while you have capital moving globally and freely across national borders, governments are in a straitjacket, basically. They can make small changes, but not the really big changes we need. So the whole point of SIMPOL is that we need governments to act, to come to agreements, and then to implement those agreements simultaneously so that no nation loses out. This SIMPOL is really based on three or four sort of key propositions. The first one is that all or sufficient nations should implement agreed measures simultaneously so that no nation loses out, everybody wins. Okay, so that breaks this vicious circle of destructive competition between governments that I was just talking about. The second point is that the policies should be multi-issue. The problem today, the reason why the UN, for example, is not making progress on the climate agreement is because we're dealing just with one issue. And whenever you deal with one single issue, there'll always be some nations that win, others that lose, and the losers, of course, have then got no incentive to cooperate. And so that's why, again, nothing much is happening. So under SIMPOL, what we're suggesting is that you would combine two or more complementary issues. So, for example, you might have a global currency transactions tax implemented globally and simultaneously to raise masses of dollars, billions of dollars, which could then be used to compensate the loser nations on the climate part of the agreement. So the idea is if you mix two or more complementary issues together, you make immediate action in every nation's self-interest, right? That's the idea. But if we carry on with this sort of single issue approach, we're never going to get anywhere. And that's why the UN, I don't know, we're on COP 35 now or something. I don't know what it is. I've lost count, you know.
In
and the third point about SIMPOL is, and this is the unique part about SIMPOL, is that it allows us to use our votes as citizens to drive politicians and eventually governments to actually implement these agreements. So the way that works is that when you sign on to SIMPOL as a citizen, you're basically saying that you will give strong preference at all future national elections to politicians or parties that have signed a pledge to implement the simultaneous policy alongside other governments. Okay, so it's and that declaration that you make when you join SIMPOL, basically it's almost like pre-selection. It's saying to politicians, so it works before election day. Okay, it works in the run-up to the election. Your national vote works on election day. Your SIMPOL vote works before election day. So it's basically saying to politicians, if you want the best chance of getting my vote, you need to sign the SIMPOL pledge. Okay. Now, and the fact that we are saying this to all politicians, we're not making a party distinction, brings all the politicians and candidates into much stiffer competition with each other. Okay. So often you will find that there are many districts or in Europe, here in UK, in parliamentary seats, as we call them, where the Conservative and the Labour candidates are sort of, you know, the difference between them in terms of support is very tiny. It can be just a few hundred votes, you know. So if we have a very small, even a small block of SIMPOL voters saying, well, we will give preference to whichever candidate signs the SIMPOL pledge, that's a very, very powerful proposition for politicians. And indeed, that's how we now have over 100 members of parliament in the UK who've signed the pledge. They come from right across the party political spectrum. We've got
how many citizens have signed onto it?
Oh, well, in the UK, probably about 10,000. So not that many, actually. And that shows you just the incredible leverage we have if people use this process. So
the thing is that the UK is a very specialized case. In the United States, it's a much more complicated because we have states, and each state requires separate lobbying. And some states are, you know, red states, and some states are blue states, and you know, we have a very, very polarized political process here in America. England is a smaller country, so
but I don't think the US is going to be one of the early adopters of this process. But what we're doing at the moment is getting it going in Europe. But I think ultimately that the US will see, you know, as global problems and climate gets worse and worse, that it's actually in their interest, in your interest, whether you're red or blue, to sign up to this. Because I think a lot of people, even on the Republican side of the fence, one of the reasons I think they're very against even acknowledging the problem of climate change is because what they fear is loss of competitiveness. They fear that business is going to suffer. They fear that the economy is going to suffer.
Well,
But the
this is
point
why
is, under
Germany
SIMPOL,
just lowered their corporate tax rate by billions
well,
of dollars in order to
well,
attract
this is
more
this is
business.
this is destructive competition in action. Exactly as
Exactly.
if one country reduces taxes, the others are sort of forced to follow. But I think the point is that from a politician's point of view, because SIMPOL would only get implemented if and when all or sufficient nations are on board, there's no
Mhm.
competitiveness disadvantage. There's no competitive disadvantage involved. That's the point, because all nations move together simultaneously. Now, I know that sounds quite outlandish, especially when there's a war going on. But I think if we are irrevocably, I think, in a globalized environment. The internet is not going to go away. Global trade is not going to go away. Global capital movements are not going to go away. So I think that the war will come to an end one day, and I think that the global economy will resume business as usual as it was before the war. So we are
Well, I
going to
have to
need.
disagree to some extent because I think I'm a little less more skeptical than you. I think that things like global trade will really start seeing a hit. And yeah, I know as greater storms kick in and more disasters around the world, a lot of things are going to start collapsing and probably in the next few years. So there isn't a lot of time to
Well,
implement
that's that.
something, politically before these things happen. Maybe you're right that once people really see what's going on, there will be an opportunity to, you say in your book, have a kind of an evolutionary jump to a more world-centric way of thinking. But it won't be the same kind of world industrialized civilization that we have now. The energy just isn't there to continue this sort of life, giant yachts or
No, no, no.
international travel,
No, no.
shipping, all these things.
I'm aware, and that's why you need global regulation to stop the excessive consumption. Um, but I mean, if one believes that there isn't enough time, well, we're all finished anyhow. So we you might as well pack up and go home anyway. Um, but I think
Well, I
that
mean, it's
in a
something that
way,
could kick in at some point in the process when awareness is really hit home. That's kind of
yeah,
what I think is
yeah, and I
possible.
mean that if
And the
you think
simple
about it, that
is a viable idea. If people have signed on to this, and the more signatures you get, the more people are thinking that way, the better. I'm all for it.
well, exactly. We haven't got what have we got to lose? I mean,
Yeah.
the reason that I've spent the last 20 years working on it, Dale, is because I'm yet to see a more viable idea that deals with destructive global competition. I mean, there are lots of criticisms you can raise about SIMPOL. It's like, oh, that'll never happen. It's, global cooperation, forget it. This guy's crazy, blah, blah, blah. There's any number of objections. But my simple question to people is, do you have a better idea? The global economy is not going away. Climate change is not going away. Leaving aside complete collapse, which is probably the most likely scenario, do you have a better idea? And if you don't, take a look and maybe sign up. That's I
Well, the
keep
UN
going
has
simply
failed
because
in 27 COPs to come to any real action, and largely because, as you say in your book, nations are out for their own national interests, and the people who are delegates there are really tied to, their national policies. They can't say, yes, let's do this right here because somebody behind them is saying, no, I can't do that. And that somebody is
absolutely,
being pushed by the destructive global
exactly,
competition, but by the fossil fuel industry and the polluting
yeah,
industries. They have huge lobbying, and they're at the
yeah,
COP.
of
They're
course,
running the COP this year.
yeah,
Al
of course,
Jabar, right?
and
So
that's why the way that SIMPOL harnesses our votes is critical, because politicians can ignore protests, they can ignore petitions, they can ignore lobbying, they can ignore anything you like. But one thing they cannot ignore is votes. They need our votes. And that's that is the key thing that SIMPOL offers citizens, is a way of taking back control of this, these runaway processes, exactly as you described, Dale, where politicians are fear for national competitiveness. They've got these vested interests behind them, trying to pulling the strings. We've got to provide a force that is greater than that in the opposite direction. And ultimately, that has got to be the vote, because politicians cannot get around that one. They need our votes. I think ultimately, though, even the people pulling the vested interests, if you like, will be coming to as things get worse, they're not going to have a business either at this rate. It's going to be in their interests ultimately to find some kind of global accommodation that doesn't harm, that maybe harms their profitability, but not greater than it harms the profitability of their competitors. Right. So they're all in the same boat. That I think they can accept. What individual nations are asking vested interests to do now is to sort of, we've got to take the lead on climate change. That's just not going to happen. So in a sense, you could ask yourself the question, what's more realistic? Asking people to act against their own interests by moving first, or asking them to act in the common interest, or act in a way that doesn't harm their own interests by moving together.
Well, this
Really,
has been the
that's
hope
what
since the
it's
League
all
of
about.
Nations, and there was the basis behind all of these kind of, and then trade agreements became more negative. Governments can be sued by corporations if they harm
Yeah,
their commercial
yeah,
interests, and this kind of thing crept into those kinds of treaties and became an even
yeah.
worse process.
Well,
NATO
that's
becomes a
that.
unifying. Is NATO really unifying, or is it a military organization that's,
Well, hang on a minute, hang on a minute. You're talking about three or four or five different things there. I mean, the
okay?
reason that we have these trade agreements. Why are these trade agreements with closed door courts where the corporation can sue governments? Why? That's because governments are desperate to make their economies more competitive, right? They want to bring corporations in, but to do that, they sacrifice citizens' rights. They sacrifice democracy, basically. So, I think one has to understand the bigger picture here, because if we want to go down all sorts of rabbit holes, we end up just blaming. We go into this sort of blame game, and actually, if destructive global competition was a person, he'd be sitting back laughing at us all. Carry on playing the blame game, because then whilst you blame each other, I carry on in the background, and we'll collapse you all. So
Well, this is
it's
a very
really,
important point in the climate movement where people, as you say in your book, have their identity based on their strident opposition to something or another. And that's what they're doing. They're in a very heavy dialectical position where it's not really producing the results they want, because we do need everybody on board. We do need cooperation for things to really work, rather than a dialectical point of view where you're the bad guy, I'm the good guy. That feels very good to me, but ultimately is not a very successful strategy.
well, absolutely. And we've got to get beyond this sort of thinking, because, this us versus them thinking, you know, as Dr. Phil would say, how's it working for you? It isn't working.
Well, the other thing is the militarization of the world, and now we can see this with the war in Ukraine, the expansion of NATO, enormous billions and billions, I think $43 billion has gone from the US to support this Ukraine war. And the enormous climate cost of that war is, I don't know if anybody's calculated it, but it's obviously a disastrous thing. And all because nations, Russia wants to be a bigger, more powerful nation. Ukraine is waving the Ukrainian flag, and really nations didn't exist. 300 years ago, all these African nations were kind of created by colonialism. The European nations were very recent things. If you think of yourself as
Mm,
French, well, many people didn't even speak French 200 years ago.
absolutely. Well, that brings up the sort of evolutionary aspect, Dale, of where we are now. Because if you take a longer evolutionary view, nation states, if you like, are just the latest expression of human governance units. And throughout evolution, we've gone from smaller to ever larger governance units. We've gone from family bands to tribes to middle-aged small states to nation states. And that evolution, why has that evolution taken place? It's taken place because of technology and a cycle of competition that has eventually got so unbearable and destructive that we've had to move to a new, higher, larger level of governance. And now, under globalize it today, we're just at the latest cycle of that pattern. And when you get to that critical stage, there are only two possibilities. You either go up to a new global level of cooperation, which is what SIMPOL lays out a framework for, or we go down the tubes. It's really as simple as that. And that has been the case throughout the whole of evolution, even going back to atoms and then molecules and then cells and multi-celled organisms. It's the same process. And I think that's an important point also in the sense that if we regard our current crisis as this sort of, oh my God, this is this terrible crisis, we'll never get out of it, we'll just panic, or we'll go into denial, or we'll just, we won't make it. But if we see it as part of this evolutionary process, and that we are at a recognizable stage in that cycle of that dance between competition and cooperation, we can see, okay, yeah, we're in a crisis, but we know where evolution wants us to go next. And that's to some sort of, global cooperative governance, not a world government, but just simply simultaneously implemented global agreements. Then I think people will feel a little bit more, I won't say relaxed, but I think a little bit more secure in the knowledge that at least we know where we're going and why we're where we are now, you know.
I couldn't agree with you more that we can only save ourselves if we recognize the unity of our processes and the unity of the global physical process of our world,
Yeah,
the ecology of the world and how ecologies work, and social ecologies as well. We have to get beyond this nation-centric concept of who we are
exactly.
as beings. Am I primarily an American, or am I primarily a human being?
Yeah.
And I agree with you.
Well,
That's
you're
kind of
you're
the
both.
mental jump that we all have to make, right?
Yeah, no, that's
um,
absolutely right. Absolutely right.
so I think we begin with things like taxes, which is such a critical idea. They're tax havens,
Yeah,
competing with each other by lowering tax rates. If
yeah,
that one thing could be affected, that would be huge. And if we could
yeah.
stop the subsidies.
If you look at all of the global problems, whether it's wealth inequality, tax havens, financial markets, uh, wealth inequality, nuclear weapons, all of these things suffer from the same destructive global competition dynamic. The fear that each nation has that doing the right thing will harm its economy. The need for a global agreement to take out these pathologies is absolutely vital. And the same goes also for artificial intelligence. Same goes for the governance of space. All of these things suffer from exactly the same uh, dynamic. And although it's, of course, a hugely ambitious thing, I think part of what I'm writing in the book, and you mentioned, we tend to think nation centrically. We look through the world through national glasses, national spectacles. And we really need to accept that we are living irrevocably now in a globalized world, which needs global cooperative governance. And you really can't have you can't have any economy that is sustainable if you don't have governance on the same scale as the economy you're trying to govern. It just doesn't work. So we just have to face up to this.
Right.
And people, of course, will say, "Oh my
Well,
God, well, how do we? That's terrible. How we? Oh, that'll never happen." But I don't think we've got any choice.
I think your book is brilliant, and it's so interesting, the psychological aspects of it, why we think the way we do, and how we are kind of trapped in certain ways of thinking and how we might get beyond it. It's a really interesting read, and I recommend it to people. If people want to sign the pledge, they can do that. If they want to encourage their politicians to sign the pledge, even better, they can do that. And we wish that this process all the success in the world, literally.
Thank you very much, Dale. Yeah, really need all the help. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on Facing Future today.
Thank you.